A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
We're turning our attention back to Christians and a biblical way of seeing finances, and a special focus today on investing. Now, there are some indicators that show a deterioration in global financial conditions. High levels of debt, volatility in global stock markets, inflation, and fears of an economic slowdown in the US are affecting our own financial outlook here. And of course, cost of living. It's identified as the biggest factor in personal and family finance ahead of the upcoming federal election. So turning our attention today to how you invest according to your Christian values. We're back today with our special guest, Alex Cook, former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner and he is the founder of Wealth with Purpose. His ministry is to help equip Christians like you and me to honour God with our finances by teaching sound financial skills. Alex Cook, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil. Great to be back with you again.
Hey, Alex, I just mentioned in that introduction there a deterioration in a whole lot of financial things that are going on around the world. There's uncertainty, there's volatility. I wonder if we might start our conversation with some sort of an economic insight that you might have been gleaning and things that you're monitoring regularly. Where do we start here with an economic update, not only for here, but maybe things that are going on around the world too?
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head with volatility. That's certainly something we've had in droves in the last 3 to 4 weeks. When we look at the stock market in particular, the Australian market and the US markets are both off around 10% each. So, that's what we would call a typical correction. The million-dollar question is, how much further has it got to go, or have we hit the bottom? But certainly not really unsurprising, given all the uncertainty surrounding the US federal government's policies that are coming out and seem to chop and change, obviously, fairly regularly. So markets, although markets you and I have spoken about, Neil, over the past couple of months, it's not really surprising that they're falling anyway, in the sense that they were priced for perfection. They were all very, very overvalued. And they were a lot of the good news was built into the markets already. What's particularly interesting, though, is through this market route, gold itself has been very stable and today hit all-time record highs of $3,000 per ounce. Not sure what that is exactly in Aussie dollars, but it's probably somewhere around the $4,500 Aussie mark for an ounce of gold. Yeah. Yeah, it's very high. So it's going really well, and it's probably showing that it is that kind of safe haven status. And so that's doing well. And then crypto, on the other hand, it's doing the opposite. It's fallen about, it depends which coin you look at, obviously, but the one that most people follow, Bitcoin, is off about 25% off its peak. So really interesting things going on in markets. But as I say, from a hardly surprising when you consider, I guess, the economic news that's coming out. And obviously the big one is the Trump tariffs and the fact that they're on again, off again. You don't really know. A lot of the analysts that we follow and track and put our commentary, they're all saying, normally they'd say, this is the effect that this is going to have. But now they're all saying we don't have a clue because we don't know what it's actually going to be, where it's actually going to end up. But certainly, I think from an Australian perspective, that the Trump tariffs so far really don't affect Australia in much of a meaningful way, not in a direct sense. I think they will indirectly. So in the direct sense, we've seen, they've announced the 25% tariffs on Australian steel and aluminium. But when you look at those metals as a proportion of what we actually export around the world, it's about 1% of our actual overall exports. When you look at mining more specifically, it's about 10% of those metals go to the United States. But look, overall, the real impact on that is very minimal. Obviously, it'll have a bit of an effect in the mining sector and on the workers in those particular niches. But really, the big effect is minimal. What I think
that might be just quickly before we move on from anything there. While we're talking about steel and aluminium, I think the fears that are coming out from some commentators is that those tariffs could extend to pharmaceuticals and agriculture, and I know the beef industry has been talking about these possibilities today too. So it's might not just be steel and aluminium.
Oh, correct. But herein lies the problem. So the whole uncertainty from any nation is you don't know what's actually coming next, whether it's a specific item or a specific nation. I mean, what we saw, for example, with the tariffs with Canada and Mexico, they're on one day, the next day they'll put on hold because they said they'd, try and close off the border. So there's all these things that are really up in the air. Now, what does that mean, though, for us all, I think more in an indirect sense? I actually think it's very simple. We're going to have a global downturn. And the reason why I say it's inevitable now is if you imagine you're running a large business, whether it's a mining business or a car manufacturer or anything like that, you have to make decisions on your supply chain, and it's very difficult to do that in this kind of environment. And so I think there's an inevitable slowdown happening that's now coming. It's actually starting to flow through to some of the data already. I think they will drive America into a recession, but I think actually America will probably be less affected than other nations around it and the ones that they're targeting with the tariffs. So I think global downturn is inevitable. Australia obviously spending this year to try and keep the Australian economy proper, but I think that the reality is you're going to see a global recession now. It was already, the American economy was already slowing down. It wasn't, firing on all cylinders. And America, like most of Europe and Australia, they're all propped up on huge government deficits that have been going for a very long time. And so to Trump's credit, obviously people are looking at the negative predominantly, but if you think about the overall objective, he's trying to reduce government spending and rein it in, which has been out of control for a very long time, and switch it to more private sector and private sector demand, which I think is the right long-term strategy. His other objective, of course, is to try and bring manufacturing back to the US. Now, whether he'll succeed on that one, I don't know, because I'm not sure that tariffs are going to do that. There are other issues that CEOs have to take into consideration, like energy costs and regulation and other things, before they're just going to go opening factories in the US. So the jury's out, I think, on that. But I think his overriding objective, which is to reduce government spending, reduce the deficit, and as many people are aware, with Elon Musk, they've announced this, Department of Government Efficiency, trying to rein in spending. That in itself, though, I think is more pride. They've already identified a bit of fraud and excess spending and waste. That's great. They're going to cut that out. And I think from what I can understand from the American population, they're all hugely in favour of that. The reality, though, when you cut government spending is you reduce GDP. You're taking money out of the economy, which is why I say a recession there and globally, I think, is inevitable, because when you suck out that spending, that's the outcome of that.
All right, just pause for a moment here, because listeners who've been listening to us talking over years now have been aware that when you've got some predictions that are going on from the Alex Cook end, those are typically coming to pass. And anyone who's got a house mortgage, when everyone was just borrowing and paying their mortgages easily, you were warning, look out, because there's some tough times coming. So global downturn, a global recession, that might mean Australian recession too. That's something, do you think, though, we ought to be concerned about? Because when we're talking about divine wisdom, Christians and our finances, when we approach good times or hard, what does it do to have a Christian faith with some appreciation that God's got your back here?
Oh, look, I think it's critical. If there was a positive side of challenging times, is it forces us to really assess our beliefs, forces us really to say, do I know God and do I trust God? And forces us to, dig deeper with that relationship. I think in that sense, the challenging periods. I mean, like, God does not promise this easy life. I know a lot of us like to think it would be easy. You become a Christian, it gets easier. God's on my side kind of thing. But the reality is the Bible warns us that life is not like that. Life is ups and downs and so forth. And so I think the positive side of it is it's an opportunity to build our relationships, learn to trust in God. But I think from a practical point of view, what I would encourage listeners is to say to yourself, are my finances aligned with God's word? That's the thing I think people need to address, because that's the thing you can control to a large degree. You and I, Neil, we've talked about this many times, is we've been warning people for years about having excessive debt. It's no surprise Australia has, crazy house prices, but a lot of that is driven by huge amounts of debt. And the Bible warns us that can lead to slavery. And so to me, before we do have any downturn, and obviously rate cuts have started, so we had the first one a couple of weeks ago, and that's expected to continue. So by the way, that's, an upside for those with a mortgage, even if there is a bit of a slow down in the economy. If you keep your job and rates come off, then that's actually going to help you. So once again, there's always different ways of looking at it. But I think the key issue for people from a Christian perspective is they say, am I doing it God's way? Am I treating the money as though it's God's and stewarding it properly? Am I taking heed to what the Bible warns me about in terms of debt? And am I still remaining generous through these tough times? Because to me, in tough times is a wonderful opportunity for the church to have that outward focus. Let's not become insular and worry about our finances. Let's think, who can we help? What can our churches do to help people? Help people through tough times if they lose their jobs, help people through, tough emotional times, marriages come under pressure under this kind of thing. So I think I try and look at these things and say, what's the opportunity here for God's kingdom? And how can we, address that and help people through this season?
Alex, an important point here. Christians are not immune from financial shocks. But preparation, and this is where I guess godly wisdom is so powerful, enables us to be able to face those tough times knowing that it wasn't just an outlook we had that everything was rosy, but there are some biblical Christian principles we might be able to apply. But today in the conversation, and listeners will know, sometimes we're talking about survival tactics when it comes to finance. Today, no doubt there'll be an element of survival tactics, but also investment value. What sort of things that we might have as a Christian biblical mindset that might actually be an upside, and making use of a difficult economic environment to invest wisely. So why do you think, just we're laying some foundation here, but why is it important for Christians to invest according to their values and not just sort of sweeping away your Christian faith to the side and saying, well, I'm going to invest with whatever the secular values might say is good? What's so strong about Christian values here? Well,
it's critical. I mean, obviously, the biblical foundation is, well, actually the money I have is really God's and I'm his steward. I'm using his money and I've got to steward it well and I've got to do it for his glory. And so when we look at the investment opportunities that are before us, with our superannuation funds and investment portfolios, we have to ask ourselves, is this something God would really want me to invest in using his resources? So, for example, in Australia, there's a proliferation of companies on the stock market, as there is in the US and indeed around the world, that are involved in things that go against our values. So gambling, for example, pornography, abortion, exploitation of people through their wages and so forth. And so do we want to put our money, or God's money, in those things? And I think the obvious answer would be no. And of course, the Bible commands us that we shouldn't conform to the world. We should be doing things God's way, not the world's way. And so that's a challenge to us. But also I think with investing, rather than also having the view about what I won't invest in, i.e. the negative screens, there's also the positive screens, and say, what can I invest in that will have a positive impact on the world? So I can still make a return, but I can also, invest and have a positive impact. So there's a whole rise of an industry called impact investing. Now, it's still in its infancy, I think, to a large degree, especially in Australia, but it means you can start putting your money to work in things that will give you a return, but also have a very positive social impact as well.
This is 2020 with Neil Johnson, helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision Christian Radio.
And our talkback line is open on 1-800 316 316. We're talking about investing today, and interesting, as Alex Cook has predicted, there are some rocky times ahead for global economies. You might have your own scenario that you'd like to present to Alex. You might have your own tip that you'd like to pass on to other listeners. So 1-800 316 316. Before we take any calls, Alex, when we're talking ethical investments, in some sense, that's one terminology you can use. That might be a broader terminology than having a Christian values-based investment. So you're not just talking about ethical investments. You're actually saying the investment you make may actually alter the whole trajectory of the way that the outcomes. If you're investing in things that are going to be kingdom-oriented, that's an interesting dimension to tackle, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, the language is always a challenge in these areas because the word ethical investing, so in Australia there is a ethical investing industry. However, when you look closely at it, most of it is what I would call green. It's more around the climate change issues and things like that, as opposed to what we would call Christian ethics per se. And so the challenge for Christians is when you think about your investments and wanting to do it in a Christian way, and trying to create a portfolio that represents biblical values by, avoiding the wrong things. And as you mentioned before, buying the right things that are positive, they're going to both get you a return and impact. It just requires more discernment, because just because something has a ethical label per se doesn't make it ethical in the Christian sense of the word. And so, you've really got to, do your homework and look under the bonnet. And what I would encourage people to think when we're talking about investing with your values, I think a lot of Christians would be shocked if they knew where their investment portfolios really were and where that money ultimately went. I think they would be quite shocked in many cases. So what I would say is that as being a good steward, what I would want you to encourage is not necessarily to become super overly involved in your investments, but more just take an active interest and say, is my portfolio investing in things that does good or does harm? And spend some time looking at it and seeing, well, can I make adjustments to make it better aligned, notwithstanding the fact that the world is imperfect. We're in a fallen world. There are limitations in Australia. The US has got a lot more Christian investments, which we can talk about later on because there's some interesting things there. But nonetheless, I just would encourage listeners to take a little bit more of a proactive approach and be more conscious of where your money really is. So I think, as I say, many people would be quite surprised at the kinds of things their superannuation is funding.
Let's talk about our Christian values and how they do actually intersect with what we do practically today, because some listeners might be thinking, well, the Bible's thousands of years old. How can it possibly have any wisdom? How can there be wisdom from the Old Testament or the New about how I invest my money today? And for some, it's going to be like, this is a long bow to stretch here. But it's those principles that we glean from the Scriptures that might reflect the heart of God. And I wonder if you've got if we can 100%. Go through some of those principles so that we're not in the dark. Because I don't think this is rocket science. This is actually fairly simple and straightforward. But obviously, you've got to do a little bit of search to understand those principles a little more deeply. Where do we start there when we talk about how the Bible gives us insight about investing?
Well, as you say, I think the key thing is to focus on the principles, because clearly the Bible doesn't point us towards specific investments in the modern age, right? It doesn't say go buy property or shares or gold or anything like that. It doesn't tell us to do that. So it is the principles, though, that should guide us and guide our decision-making, because they are timeless, and they could be very, very helpful to us in terms of protecting the money. So the first, I think, principle is that we need to be found faithful, and we need to be faithful stewards of what God has given us. That's the starting point. And when we look at, say, an example of one of the parables is the parable of the talents or the gold bags, depending on which version of the scripture you're reading. And we read that in Matthew 25. And it talks about the importance of investing resources wisely. You have the story of the master who goes away and leaves each of his servants with different amounts. And there is an expectation that they get a return on that money. And so my message here would be that whatever God's put in your hands, he wants you to get a return on it. Now, am I saying a stock market return? Not really. What I'm saying is ultimately that the real return will be an eternal one. Are we being good stewards with God has put in our hands, and are we getting an eternal return on those funds?
Let's take a call. David is in Wee Waa. Hey, David, welcome along.
Hey, how you going?
Good. Need to be fairly quick, but what are your thoughts here?
I got to be honest, man. I have no clue why I'm on. I'm just on my lunch break right now at work, and I just got called by you guys.
Wow. Okay.
On another note, I will say I've submitted a song to you guys, and it's coming out at 2:00 today. Sorry for the plug.
All right, okay, right. So there's a little bit of a mixed wires in there, some crossed wires. But anyway, we're having a conversation. Are you listening into the conversation right now, David?
I heard a bit. I heard how the last fellow that was talking, he was talking about investing and how Jesus' return will be an eternal one. Not a worldly return or a temporal return.
Okay, well, we're talking investing, and, you were calling on a different purpose, and we might be able to redirect your call to another more appropriate place. But, yes, the return of Jesus, that's interesting, because I'll just get a perspective here from our guest, Alex. Some people are saying, I don't care about doing wise investing. Any moment now, Jesus is going to return and it won't all matter. Wise stewardship, it's got a longer term view, hasn't it? Just a quick thought on that, because, it's something that David's picked up here.
Yeah. Well, look, I mean, we don't know when Jesus is going to return because, unfortunately, he hasn't told us that. I'm not sure we'd want to know necessarily either. But certainly, to me, the issue is that money is a tool in the hands of the believer. And the believer, therefore, has a responsibility to use that tool wisely, both for the benefit of themselves and their families, but as well as especially for the benefit of others and God's kingdom. So that, to me, is the, if you like, the eternal aspect of it, to treat money as a tool. That's how I'd be encouraging listeners to think about it.
Okay, thank you so much to David, and we'll see if we can get you redirected to another section here at Vision. Hey, just a minute or two out from the news, one of those other profound principles, avoiding greed and dishonest gain. If you're not applying your biblical principles, the likelihood of falling into some other dishonest way of investing might well be the way you go. A quick thought from you, Alex?
Yeah, well, look, it's interesting with wealth in the Bible. The Bible never paints wealth as a negative thing, but it does warn us about what can happen to us. And that is that we can fall in love with money. So, one of the passages often misquoted is the one about money is the root of all evil, when it says the love of money is the root of all evil. And so I think the issue for a believer is that they guard their heart, and that when they think about investing, it's very easy to get carried away with investing. You see your portfolio going up, you start to think, I'm doing well. The important thing is to guard our heart, make sure our reasons for doing things are sound, and entrusting it to God, because ultimately it's His. And so we do need to make sure that we're not being greedy along the way. And of course, we're treating money in ways that are honest and ethical.
Earlier on in our conversation, you were suggesting that we look like we're headed for a global downturn, even global recession that certainly would affect us here in Australia. For listeners who might be thinking, I'm not hearing that in the mainstream media, I'm not hearing that on my usual sources of news, on social media, why should I be concerned about some downturn coming this year? Any thoughts, though?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think when we look at the history of tariffs, one of the inevitable outcomes is this tit-for-tat approach that's going on, and we're seeing that obviously with Canada and America, China and America, and Australia thankfully hasn't gone that path so far. Albo hasn't announced any tit-for-tat responses to what's happened so far. But the thing about tariffs is they essentially end up as an expense to the end consumer, because the tax gets, the importer pays the tariff, and they pass on that cost in the supply chain. So the end consumer is really the one that ends up paying it. We all end up paying more, and so you've got less in your pocket. And of course, if countries retaliate, then it just keeps going back and forth. And so what we know, particularly from the 1930s with the Great Depression, because they brought in tariffs back then, is it caused a significant downturn in global trade. And I think what Trump's doing now, he's got his various reasons for doing it, but I think the inevitable outcome of that is a slowdown in global trade. So as I say, even though Australia is not really directly affected particularly much, what we're sending to the US is not, big deal, but we will be affected by the broader picture of a global slowdown, and that's what will hit our shores, I think, more indirectly.
I want to invite listeners join in our conversation today, help direct where it goes. 1-800 316 316. You can send us a text too. Simply open your Vision app, and onto the Vision radio stream, you'll find two buttons there, one that says call and one that says text. You can send us a text too if you have a question that you'd like to run by Alex Cook. But before we take any calls, there are all sorts of ways we can invest, whether it's property or into the stock market. Some people choose to invest in index funds. Popular way here and around the world. And when we're talking ethical investment and certainly applying our Christian values, what are your thoughts around index funds? Are they a safe way to negotiate things going forward?
I'll probably start just by giving people just a 2-second explanation of what we mean by an index fund. So many Aussies, obviously, in the evening will watch the evening news and on the finance sector, and they'll see them referring to what's called the All Ordinaries Index. And so they'll talk about whether the All Ordinaries Index went up and down on a particular day. Well, the All Ordinaries is simply a basket of shares, and its value rises and falls as the share market goes up and down. So what index investing simply is a basket of shares that represent a particular market. So there's indexes on stocks and on bonds and on property funds and all sorts of different things. But the challenge, and this is where I guess the problems start to kick in for Christians, is when you buy an index fund, you are essentially buying the entire market. So you're buying pretty much every company that makes up that index. And then, of course, that means you then have exposure to things that are not in line with, Christian values. So, we mentioned before things like abortion, pornography, gambling, there's weapons manufacturing, there's a whole list of different things. And so the question then becomes, as a Christian, do you really want to have your money in those things? Now, the reason why it's so critical is roughly 50% of the money going into stock markets these days is going via index funds. So they have become a huge phenomenon, and some of the biggest fund managers in the world, like BlackRock and Vanguard and State Street, they are all big index funds. And so by investing in these funds, firstly, we've given an enormous amount of power to a tiny, tiny number of people that run these funds for a start. But as I say, the issue for a Christian is when you invest in a index fund, there is no moral screening attached to it. There's no thought process. You're just investing in the whole market. And I think, and one of the comments I made earlier, Neil, was that I think as Christians, we want to take that little bit more of an active approach. As I say, I don't want to turn people into day traders or watching the stock market all day, every day. That's not the objective. But it's merely to say that we want to start looking a bit deeper at where our money is actually going and the impact it's therefore having on our society and so forth, because it's very possible that you're funding the enemy with your investments. We can be supporting companies that are directly opposed to Christian values.
Alex, if you have an investment in index funds, can you be in contact with the index fund and say, can you divert my investment to streams within the investment portfolio that will be aligned with my values? Do you think there's any people in these management of these index funds that might be even familiar with the fact that there are some people who have a more ethical way of investing?
It's a great question. So the short answer is there is the rise of an industry now. In fact, interestingly, in Australia, some listeners will remember Christian Super used to exist in Australia. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore. They actually created an ethical index. So basically, it was still an index fund, so essentially managing, putting your money into a basket of securities that represented the market, but if you like, to use an expression, with the thin stocks removed. In the US, they're much more fortunate than us in the sense that they have a whole investment industry called biblically responsible investing. In fact, there's now $100 billion in US, what I would call Bible-based investment. And some of those are ethical indexes. In other words, they're essentially taking the whole market, but stripping out the things that go against Christian values. So the short answer is these things do exist. Sadly, not really in Australia at the moment. I'm not aware of any ethical index in Australia. As I say, Christian Super used to have one. But in the US, certainly there is. And I would imagine that is going to be coming in the future, hopefully even in Australia. But yeah, if you rang up an index fund and said, "Can you invest it ethically?" They'd look the other way.
Okay, all right. I've got some texts that have come through from listeners. One says, "Hi, my name's Rebecca. It's a good topic to discuss." And she's saying, "What is Temu doing to the Australian economy, positive or negative? I know Rockman's and Rivers clothing stores are closing. Many thanks for your time, Rebecca." What do we make of Temu and the fact that we've got some closures of some well-known brands?
Well, you have to excuse my ignorance on the Temu one. I haven't heard of Temu. If you tell me a bit about it,
Chinese-based online seller. Ethical concerns I think that people have sometimes around the fact that it is Chinese and that there may be a whole lot of harvesting of your personal details that may find their way into the hands of the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, some of this, I'm not sure how much credence we give to all of that, but when you've got international players, big retailers or platforms like Temu, does that affect an economy? And the fact that Rebecca's mentioned the likes of Rivers Clothing and Rockman's Clothing closing down, this thought of buying cheap goods from offshore and affecting economies. Any thoughts around that?
Well, the problem with it, once again, putting Temu to one side, the online economy is it's what I would describe as inevitable. I mean, it already is massive, and Amazon is probably the best example in the sense it's what we call a category killer, right? It comes in and destroys entire categories. So, I used to love as a youngster going into Dymocks bookstores, but those stores are just not viable anymore when you're competing against Amazon and the fact that people can buy a book cheaply online. And so to me, there's an inevitability about it, and there is some downsides, obviously, where particularly some of these big companies are just becoming so big and having such enormous power over entire markets. So there's a downside to it, but there's also an inevitability in the sense that in a downturn, the reality is many Australians, and this applies anywhere, are going to go for the cheaper options. I think, and I don't think that's a problem per se. I think the problem for us, for Christians, is just making sure that the products that you're buying aren't ethically tainted. They're not coming from, slave workshops and all that kind of thing. I mean, once again, that's not always easy to know. But there are companies that do research that kind of thing and, put an ethical stamp on it, so to speak. I always say with these kind of things, it's how far do you want to take it? We're talking today, Neil, about investing with values. I say to people, look, it's not a perfect world. You're not going to find perfect investments. So you have to decide with your conscience and between you and God just how far you want to take it. And I think you could apply the same to what you buy. And I think we should, as Christians, be conscious about what we buy and what we invest in. But the question is how far should one take it? And I think that's a question between an individual and God. But I think active stewardship involves being conscious of these things and being intentional. I think we need to be.
I might just mention for Rebecca too, it's Baptist World Aid that does a lot of that good research into some of those ethical investments by way of, who's creating the clothing that you're wearing. And there's some really interesting things to explore there, but you could no doubt get some the Ethical Fashion Report, I think, from the Baptist World Aid website. Hey, another question from a text from a listener, Trevor in West Swan in Western Australia says, I'm thinking about moving my super investments into NDIS housing as direct ownership in various houses. What are your thoughts? Trevor from WA, NDIS housing. Alex.
Yeah, so look, obviously, Neil, we can't give advice on air, so I just want to put that disclaimer out there. That's important. My thought initially for Trevor is be very, very careful, do your research, because a lot of these things are dependent on government funding and government rules that could change. Legislation could come in and change that. So what I would give you, the most important thing, because you're talking about your super here, so we're talking about your retirement savings and possibly your life savings. The biblical principle from Ecclesiastes chapter 11 verse 2 is invest in 7 ventures, yes in 8, because you do not know what disaster may come upon the land. So whether you go NDIS or any investment, it's very important that you don't put all your eggs in one basket and that you really do your homework. And I always say to people and to clients, I say things like, if you're going to invest in something, what is your exit strategy? How are you going to get your money back? Because it's one thing, it's easy to get into an investment, it's harder to get out. So make sure you know what your exit strategy is and how you're going to get your money back if you need it. So I can't comment specifically on NDIS, but I would say just be really careful of anything that is driven by government legislation that can change, because there's no doubt that NDIS in Australia is out of control. It's growing like at a rate of knots. It's just not sustainable. So who knows what the government will do in the future to it in terms of cutbacks and so forth, and how that might affect your investment. So diversify and really do your homework.
Alex, when we talk about the index funds that we were discussing, and that's like for a lot of people a set and forget, and somebody else is managing your investment, you were saying just be cautious there. So is it wisest then to choose your own specific companies to invest in? And you said you're not saying to everyone just become a day trader and monitor your investments every day, but is it still wisest if you're going to apply a biblical ethic to the way that you're investing to be ultra cautious around the companies that you're investing in?
Look, I'd say I think so. I think the responsible thing as a believer is that we want to have what I would call active stewardship in this regard. We want to be discerning about where we're putting our money so that we know that what we're funding is not funding, as I say, things that completely violate, the Christian faith. And given that it's God's money, we want God to be able to say, well done, good and faithful servant, you did the right thing with it. So in terms of the practical side of it, though, there's different ways you can do it. Now, you can take a more active thing and you can become, if we pick on the stock market, for example, you can start choosing individual stocks and build a portfolio, a diversified portfolio of blue chip companies, ones that you know and you've spent time researching and that you're comfortable with ethically. So that's one way to do it. And you can do that through your superannuation fund. Most funds allow you, or many these days allow you to choose individual investments. If you want to, you can take it one step further. You can set up what's called a self-managed super fund, and that's where you have really complete control. So certainly for a believer, you'll have total control over where you end up putting the money. They have some downsides to it in terms of costs and so forth. But also some investments are what I call ethically neutral. So things like, for example, gold and silver, most property is ethically neutral, whether it's a house or a, office building. Those things are fairly ethically neutral. They're neither positive nor negative. It's more with the stock market, particularly where you're investing in businesses that may be completely contrary to what we believe as Christians. So there is, I believe, an opportunity for all of us just to take a little bit more of a proactive approach, particularly as Australians, we have compulsory superannuation. Therefore, part of our wages is going off every month to funding things because at the end of the day, the stock market is about capital and raising capital for businesses. That's why it exists. And so are we putting our capital into things that we really want to be funding? And therefore, that's why I say we want to take that more active approach and get involved and ask ourselves, our question is, where is my money really invested?
Let me ask you one of those ticklish questions, though, that I know that there'll be people listening saying, well, if I'm investing in these companies and they might be ethical and they might be even, supporting kingdom values and Christian values, but what about the return on investment? Am I going to be disadvantaged if I take control and I say I'm going to do ethical investing? Does that mean my return might be less? That's one of the big concerns because investors are always interested in the last dollar. What are your thoughts here for maximising your return and doing ethical investment too?
Look, it's a really interesting question and an important one too. There's been quite a bit of research over the last 20 years amongst those who are in what we call the ethical funds management industry, which, as I say, tends to have a bit of a green bias and so forth. But a lot of those funds have done research around this, and it suggests that taking an ethical approach does not in any way lead to poor returns. But I think there's another way to look at it, and that I use the word quality. If you invest in businesses that have a quality approach, or if you like a Judeo-Christian approach into the way they run their business, so for example, the way they treat their staff, the way they treat their suppliers and their customers, you're more than likely going to end up with something that's going to do well. Because if you think about it logically, a business that treats staff well are likely to keep the staff, so they're going to have low turnover, they're going to have far greater loyalty, and so that makes you more profitable by default because changing staff and having high turnover is extremely expensive and very negative on profit. So I think taking that ethical approach and investing in businesses that are well run with good quality people, whether they're believers or not, because obviously clearly in Australia there's not a huge body of believers running these big businesses. But if you can find good people running quality businesses, I think you can sleep comfortably knowing that doing the right thing pays off. And I think ultimately we stand before God anyway, and doing the right thing is the only thing that matters ultimately. But I don't believe, to answer your question, I don't believe it will negatively compromise your returns over the long term.
A quick question from another listener. Ken says, "Hi Alex, could you please comment on investing in crypto, XRP, etc.? It seems a very confusing article for investing." Thoughts here on crypto in general? You said crypto is tanking right now. What are your thoughts for Ken?
Look, the way I've always treated crypto is as something that's highly speculative. The reason why I, avoid it like the plague is simply the fact that, to me, it's not a store of wealth. I mean, at the end of the day, when you invest, you want to invest in things that have a logic behind them as to what they're worth and what they're going to do in the long term. So, for example, when you buy a business, let's pick on one, like, say, BHP, is it likely that BHP is going to continue to expand and grow its mining over the next 20 odd years? And the answer is yes. And likewise, if you think of a business like Woolworths, Australia's population is growing, you would expect them to sell more groceries over the next 20 years. So to me, that's a really simple, logical way that these companies are going to grow and create a growing income stream for their investors. On the other hand, though, if you look at crypto, well, apart from there being no income behind them, they're extraordinarily volatile, like 10% moves in a day. You don't know really where they're going to end up. At the moment, they're also going through huge regulatory changes. So the message I always say to people with crypto is don't put it in there any money that you're not willing to lose, because I think it could, take Bitcoin, maybe it goes to $1 million or maybe it goes to zero. The short answer is I haven't got a clue, but I do know that from the profile of the average investor, it's just not suitable. It's just not going to give you reliable income or reliable returns or anything like that. For me, it's extremely risky and it's speculative. I know I know a lot of Christians that do invest in crypto, but I also know others that are adamantly against it because they see it as gambling. Of course, the Bible doesn't want us to gamble. So once again, it's always a question of how far do you want to take these things. But I would say to people, look, exercise a huge amount of caution in these things and don't put any money in there that you're not willing to lose.
And, of course, a little divine wisdom. Prayerfully considering your investments, no doubt, is going to be very important too. Hey, I'm taking away something from this conversation today, Alex. Our money has power. Our money has influence, and where there's mass movement to what we'd call a biblical ethical investment, could have huge difference to the outcomes for the future. And I know that listeners will be wanting to check in with you and even check on some of the free resources they might be able to access on your website. Alex Cook is a former stockbroker. He's been a successful financial planner, and he is the founder of Wealth with Purpose. The website is wealthwithpurpose.com. Free books, the My Toolkit, there's video content, podcast content there. You can follow Alex on Facebook and on Twitter. Alex, you also have a bunch of initiatives and events and things that are coming up. Is there anything particular that you've got for listeners that we can mention?
In the next couple of weeks, we'll be launching a live retirement course. So obviously, one of the big concerns many people have is, will I have enough in retirement? So we'll have a 4-week live webinar course on that. And then another one that we're bringing back from a few years ago is aimed at pastors, called the Stewardship Summit. Because one of our passions is helping church leaders to grow generous churches and to be able to teach stewardship and to advance the kingdom by having healthy financial churches. And so that'll be coming up as well in the next couple of months as well. So, wealthwithpurpose.com and get jumping on our newsletter will help people keep up to date with these kind of events and activities that we've got.
Yes, subscribe, get the Wealth with Purpose newsletter and keep abreast with some of these things, the wisdom that's coming from Alex Cook. And, when he's talking biblical foundations, we're talking divine wisdom when it comes to finances. Wealthwithpurpose.com. Alex, always great. Let's not leave this too long before we get together again. Thanks so much for sharing your insights once again today on 2020.
My pleasure. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.